Hi, Anthony.
Hi, Kai. Great to see you again.
Great to see you as well. Maybe let's start with you introducing yourself to the audience.
Okay, very briefly. I'm a UK-based writer. Now written 12 books and co-authored a 13th over the last 20 years. I have two academic papers to my credit, with a number in pending as well, which I'm thinking about. And generally, my general area of interest is the consciousness interface with reality. And is consciousness located in the brain, or is the consciousness a field outside of it? My overall mantra that I use in all my writing is extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proofs, the Marcello Trui concept, because I feel that if we are to understand how the brain functions and how it seems that there are parapsychological effects out there, be it from ESP to out-of-body experiences to near-death experiences, we have to take on the scientists. We have to make it scientific. We have to make it rational. We have to make it logical in such a way that the ideas just cannot be dismissed. Because for me, the area that you and I are interested in, the people we know are interested in, is the pointer towards a change in the paradigm of science. I mean, I'm a sociologist by training, and I was always very interested in the Thomas Kuhn model of theory of scientific revolutions, and the idea that all sciences change not necessarily, or the way we understand the world doesn't change over gradually. It changes with a revolution very quickly. And the revolution that we had, in 1900 with Max Planck, when he came across his idea of energy was quantized, and of course in 1905 with Einstein in his great year of papers, that changed everything. And suddenly the traditional science of the worldview of the Newtonian model of science changed, and materialism just changed there and then. And then we're now developing, and it is clear that there is a strong association between consciousness and the observer and quantum effects. So therefore, the great area in the Great Revolution now will be making a link between the relationship between a consciousness, or the measurer or the observer, and quantum effects, because we know from quantum mechanics, and we know from various elements from the twin slit experiment and various other areas, there seems to be a relationship between the wave function and the collapse of the wave function and the observer. So these are areas that I move forward in. And in my books, I've explored near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, DMT experiences over the years. And I have an overall concept I call Cheating the Ferryman. Well, I have a number of concepts. Because I worked in business many years, I always realised you need to have a snappy way of describing your ideas. And Cheating the Ferryman, I think, is unique to myself. Although, funnily enough, recently I discovered that there's a rock band that have just started up in the north of England called Cheating the Ferryman. And when I found out about this, I contacted them because it's somebody I know. And yes, they have been influenced by my writing. So there's now rock bands playing, using my concept.
Cool name.
But basically, so that's a little bit about the background to me. My books are in most European languages and many minor European languages. In fact, I found one of my books in the world's most beautiful bookstore in Buenos Aires in November when I was down there, in one of the Spanish editions of one of my books. So the books are out there. Check them out, and that's basically me.
Awesome. Could you actually describe the idea of cheating the ferryman? What is it about?
Okay. In effect, if you go back to the ancient Greeks, when somebody died, they would place a small coin. Well, they'd do one of two things. They'd either place a small coin underneath the tongue of the person that had died, or they would place the coins over the eyes. And different traditions did it in different ways. And the reason they did that was, the idea was that when the person died and they went into spirit form, they would find themselves on the banks of the river Styx. And there'd be something called a shade, which is the ancient Greek term for a spirit. And through the mists of the river Styx would come Charon, the boatman. And the shade would have to pay the boatman a payment to allow them to go over, to take them over to the land of the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I argue we cheat the ferryman. We never actually pay the ferryman his fee. And I was quite intrigued by this because I subsequently did some research into ancient Greek beliefs. And I discovered something quite fascinating, that the ancient Greeks believed that when you died and you crossed the river Styx, you were given an option when you were the other side of the river. And you either had the option of drinking the waters of one of the rivers, which would allow you to live in the underworld, or you had a second choice of going back to live your life again. And in order to do that, you had to drink the waters of the river Lethe, which is known as the river of forgetting. And what would happen is you drink the waters of the Lethe, and all your past life memories of who you had been on Earth evaporated.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be taken back across the river, and you'd be effectively reborn again. And you'd live your life again. Mm-hmm. Now, effectively, this is what Cheating the Ferryman argues. I argue that the ancient Greeks and many ancient civilizations were aware of this concept. And it's the idea of the eternal recurrence or the eternal return, that everything is in cycles. Everything is cyclical. And I argue that life is cyclical in exactly the same way. We get reborn after we die, but we don't get reborn in the traditional way of reincarnation, which is, you get reborn as somebody else and you don't remember who you were previously. I argue that's too simplistic. And also it doesn't really work. You have to argue, well, if somebody is reincarnated, how does their spirit move from the corpse to another body somewhere else, which could be geographically many miles away? In time terms, you could be reborn 10 years, 20 years later. And there's no scientific structure as to how that could possibly occur, how transmigration of souls can occur. Mm-hmm. So to me, that was a problem. I didn't have a problem per se with reincarnation because I think it has a lot of interesting factors, but it just didn't make sense for me scientifically. Mm-hmm. But I believe if you argue Cheating the Ferryman, the argument is you go back and you're reborn again as yourself in the final second.
The same person.
Yes, the same, but you are reborn in the same life that you live now. It's like Groundhog Day.
The same year that you were born previously, you're born again.
Yeah, in the same year, to the same parents, in the same location. But I have certain caveats to that, so we'll come on to those in a second. But what happens is it's in the final seconds while the brain is still alive. Now, this is the important point, is that people argue, well, how can you live after death? Your brain's dead. We are created by the brain, arguably. People say this, that the brain is what generates consciousness. The brain is, and even if the brain is a receiver of consciousness, if the brain is dead, consciousness can't be embodied in any way. Mm-hmm. So what I argue is that all this happens in a living brain in the final seconds of your life, or the final microseconds of your life. And the reason I come to this conclusion is based upon both the phenomenological aspects of the near-death experience, what people report happens to them in the near-death experience. Because what you really have to do is to listen what people are saying when they are having a near-death experience. There's something called the Moody traits and the Grayson traits, which are a group of typologies, groups of experiences that near-death experiences report that doctors will use to test whether it was a near-death experience or not. And some of them are really quite fascinating. It's the idea you have a feeling that time slows down. You know, it's one of the major factors is that when you have a near-death experience, your concept of time changes. You experience a different type of time, which of course I apply in the books. I apply Einsteinian time. I apply Minkowskian time to it. So I do the science in the background. So there's the science, the dilation effect as well. The time travels longer, and it seems to be, from your subjective point of view, time takes longer to pass. Mm-hmm. Then there is the meeting with the being of light. People say that, you know, you meet this figure, this wisdom figure, who may look like a religious figure. It may come across as Jesus. It may come across as a teacher. It may come across as somebody that you've known in your previous life that you are very attached to. But different cultures have different beings of light. And in my last book on near-death experiences, I discussed this, that the being of light, whatever it is, it's not what it's pretending to be. It's disguising itself. Within ufological terminology, it's actually masking itself to look like something else. like aliens seem to do within ufology. So that's the second factor. The next factor, which is the most important for treating the ferryman, which is the most mysterious aspect of near-death experience reporting, is the panoramic life review. It's when people turn around and say, my life flashed before my eyes. And again, you know, it has been reported throughout the centuries. These are not just things that people report after Raymond Moody wrote his book, I think, in 1971 or something. It's always been reported. And it's found in all cultures. Different cultures have different weightings as to what they experience, but effectively it's a universal effect. Now, I did some research and I discovered that all these effects can be put down to what's happening in the brain. They're all brain generated. They're all to do with the release of particular neurotransmitters in the brain during times of stress. Like, for instance, I'll guarantee you've had the experience, and there'll be little listeners or watchers, whoever we call the people that are listening in or watching in here, whereby you are given bad news, or you fall, or you're in a car crash. You feel that time dilates, don't you? It's a feeling that time slows down. Now, what that is a release of specific neurotransmitters during times of stress. It's technically known as the glutamate flood. Glutamate is the major neurotransmitter of the mammalian brain. And this is one of the effects that glutamate does. I know this because I tie in with near-death experiences another psychological or neurological state called temporal lobe epilepsy. And they can be both mirrored. And they're both similar. In fact, when temporal lobe epileptics have a temporal lobe seizure, they're effectively having a mini near-death experience. Wow. They encounter beings. They do. And I know this from literally hundreds of temporal lobe epileptic people from around the world who've contacted me. So there are the things. But the mystery thing to me is this panoramic life review. What's going on here? So again, I went into great detail and research on this as to how memory works, how memory is functions within the brain, where memories are held. And it's interesting to discover that even now, neurologists and neuroscientists, they know where memory might be kind of processed. And that's in the amygdala, which is, again, curiously very close to the temporal lobes. But it seems to be that it's stored in some way. And we can recall, under certain circumstances, we can have total recall, like the Philip K. Dick movie, whereby we can remember things that happened in our past in great detail. We know this when people are hypnotized, and they're hypnotized back to a period of time in their lives. And one of the most influential cases of this, which I was really interested in, was there was a case very close to where we met. You know, we met in Contact in the Desert last month. Yeah. There's a place called Chowchilla, which is in the valley where we were, but down in that part of, you know, Palm Springs and everything else. It's in that area. And in 1973, I think it was, there was a very famous case whereby a group of school children had been abducted. It was a really strange case. The kids were literally abducted. The school bus driver was driving along, and suddenly a car drives in front of him, makes the car stop. They dragged the driver out of the car, out of the school bus, throw him down, and they kidnapped the kids, and they buried them. They buried the bus with the kids inside for some bizarre reason. Okay, now, but the interesting factor on the Chowchilla case is how they solved it and how they found the kids. Because what they did was they got hold of the driver and they said, okay, we're going to take you back. We're going to put you into a hypnotic trance and we're going to take you back in time. So they took him back in time under hypnotic trance. And they took him back and they said, right, you're now driving the bus. What can you see? And he turns around and he said, oh, I see a car. It's just come out in front. And then they said, can you read the number plate? And he could. And he read the number plate. And from that, they were able to trace the owners of the car and eventually rescue the kids. Now, to me, this intrigued me. So this means that effectively, it's like we have the ability to remember everything we've ever experienced. But for some reason, we can't. So the question is, why does the brain do that? Why does the brain record everything? And if it does, where does it record it? Now, there's been research done over the years, and there's more strong evidence that the brain creates memories and everything else, and they store memories holographically within the brain. It's stored during quantum effects within the brain, non-locally.
Hmm.
using the holographic effects.
Have
And
you, sorry, have you considered that, it just came to me that maybe when people go through, regression hypnosis to remember something, it's kind of like remote viewing, where
mm,
if they don't remember it in their brain, they kind of remote view the past, and they are able to,
yes,
because they are in that hypnotic state, right? I don't know. Is
yeah,
that
very
a
wise. It's one of the elements I discuss in one of my books. And what I argue is that, and it's going a little bit forward. We can come back to cheating the ferryman, but another element I have in the hypothesis is the being I was calling the being of light, which I mentioned earlier on. I call that being the daemon. The being of light is in fact your own higher self.
Mhm.
It's we are existing in an instantation, a simulation, effectively created by our brains, and we have a game player, and the game player is the immortal you, the
Mhm.
you that's lived all the lives and remembers all of them. Now I call that the daemon. So we have an everyday person that is a person that lives the life once, and I call that an Eidolon. These are all ancient Greek terms. Okay.
Mhm.
So the Eidolon is the person that just lives life once. It's like when you start playing a computer game, a third person computer game where you're in a virtual environment and you switch on the game and there you have the little sprite on the screen and it runs down a corridor, goes into a room, there's a big monster and it gets killed. That's an Eidolon. It's lived one life. It doesn't remember anything. It just remembers that life.
Mhm.
But the game player does remember that life, doesn't it? The game player has already played one game and suddenly knows that that room is dangerous.
Mhm.
So what happens is the game player then starts a new game with a new Eidolon in the same environment, looking identical, and it
Mhm.
realizes it shouldn't go in that room because there's a monster. So what it does is it guides its Eidolon to not do so by guidance, by giving hunches. I have a concept I call the Huxleyan spectrum. Basically, the Huxleyan spectrum is how open the Eidolon is to demonic thought.
Mhm.
Certain people, they are guided through their life by a voice.
Mhm.
They are guided to such an extent that physically their body will move differently. Their body will be taken control of. It's called alien hand syndrome.
Mhm.
And I argue that this is all the daemon trying to take control of the Eidolon's life to make sure the Eidolon doesn't make a mistake.
Mhm.
So it will do anything it can to avoid. Because remember, it will play the game many times, and there'll be many Eidolons, all of which will die. But the
Mhm.
daemon remembers. So each time it plays the game, it has more information about the simulation environment. So it can help you.
Right.
Now, this is how, and the daemon works in peculiar ways, because sometimes the Eidolon has an inkling, very technical term inkling, because this is exactly what an inkling is. An inkling is a feeling, a strange feeling you have about something.
Mhm.
And I think a definition of an inkling is also like a deja vu sensation.
Mhm.
It's an inkling that you have perceived this moment before at an indeterminate time in your past.
Right.
This again is the definition used by a guy called Vernon Neppe, who is a professor of psychology in Seattle, Harborview Hospital. I think it's a Harborview. No, I'm not sure. But anyway, Vernon is the guy that came up with the definition of deja vu. Now, I argue that we all experience something more profound than this called deja vu. And deja vu is literally already lived.
Mhm.
So when you come across a set of circumstances that you suddenly have this feeling of recognition, it's because you've done it before.
Mhm.
And the daemon sometimes will do that just to give you a little nudge to
Mhm.
say, this is a game. You're in a game.
Mhm.
Okay. This is something that Riz Verk is doing with his work, which is getting a lot of interest at the moment. I've been doing it for 20 years. There you go.
Right.
And the idea is that within that, the game player can influence in one way or another. Now,
Mhm.
going back, I would then argue, because I am coming to answer your question, because I then argue that, and I cannot prove this, I can prove the daemon and the Eidolon scientifically, I can prove them neurologically,
Mhm.
and I can prove them neurologically in my books. So it's not as if I'm just making these terms up. I do the neurology. But
Mhm.
effectively, I argue that, and I can't do the science of this to the extent, I believe that there's another higher level of intelligence within this. So there's the Eidolon, which is the everyday life. Then there's the
Mhm.
daemon, which is the immortal you that lives all your lives. And I
Mhm.
believe above that is something I call the uber daemon. And the uber daemon is effectively the daemon of all humanity. It's the greater self. It is effectively a modern day version of the Jungian collective unconscious or the
Right.
overself.
Like
And I believe what happens is
consciousness.
I'm sorry.
Unity consciousness, some people
Yes,
call it.
unity. It's very much the is it William Buck, the guy that came up with the book in 1900 about consciousness and consciousness being a field and everything. And I argue that that field of information can sometimes be accessed during deep hypnotic states or even light hypnotic states. So what happens is the Eidolon, when they're hypnotized by a regressionist, for instance, or like the bus driver, what they can do is they can bypass demonic consciousness and enter the uber daemonic consciousness, which means that they can access the life histories of all humanity.
Right.
So suddenly when somebody is hypnotized and they become a 17th century French peasant and they live their lives and they have pictures and images, it doesn't mean that that person was that French peasant. But in a very real sense, they were, because at the higher level, it's a unity. All humanity is one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. So all you're doing is you're going into higher versions of yourself, and each higher version has a greater memory bank, as it were, of reality. And then I argue that there's another level above that, which I call the Godemon. And the Godemon is effectively the consciousness that is collapsing the wave function of the universe. It's the consciousness that we would call God, the Or Ein Sof, within the Kabbalah, Brahman, within Hinduism and Vedanta. There is again this idea in so many cultures, in so many magical traditions, that we are all God experiencing reality subjectively. And we are doing this because we are creating our own soap opera that we exist within. God would get very bored if he was in a universe where he was just sitting around, floating around, not doing anything. So he embodies himself into the simulation to experience everything. And he suffers then from amnesis, which is again a term from Plato, which again the ancient Greeks believed that we were all one consciousness, suffering from amnesis with the sense of forgetting. Now, this again is the writings. A lot of people out there may be aware of the writings of Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer. I wrote the latest biography of him a few years ago. And in this, I went into Philip K. Dick's philosophy of forgetfulness. And he wrote a novel towards the end of his life where he has a character called Manny. And Manny effectively is God embodied within the world. You know, so this is all a lot of people out there who are into magical traditions and traditions like this will be nodding their heads happily here, because I get a lot of magical tradition people saying you're doing the science of magic. And I am, like I'm doing the science of Hinduism and I'm doing the science of Buddhism. So that's how regression occurs. But each individual Eidolon and Daemon, I call it the Daemon Eidolon dyad. So that's your higher self and you just living the same life over and over again. Now, the point is, it's not the same life. And it is so important to gauge this, because what happens is that when you start living that life, you have to realize that where you were born last time, and where you were located, depended upon decisions made by your parents, didn't it? Your parents decided to live in Vancouver or wherever they decided to live, but they could have chosen to live in Australia. They could have emigrated to Australia, in which case you would have still been you. You would still look the same, but you would be a different version of you that had had a completely different life experience. And the records of that also exist within, for want of a better term, Irvin Laszlo's Akashic field. And again, Laszlo and I wrote a book together a few years ago about this. Okay. This is why I say, that every avenue I've already gone down. Okay. So the Akashic field or the Akashic record is the memory again of all humanity. So there's a version of you that would have been born in Australia. There's a version of you that could have been born anywhere that could happen. Indeed, Brian Cox, the British scientist, and his professor, a guy called Jeff Forshaw, who I did an event with 15 years ago in London, by the way, they wrote a book on quantum mechanics. And the subtitle was Everything That Can Happen Will Happen. And of course, it's very similar to that Korean movie, is it? Everything Everywhere All at Once. I believe this is true. This is what happens. So there is a version of you that can follow any line of your life that's possible.
Hmm.
Because
So
remember, in the
it
movie,
kind of it sort of follows the many world interpretation of quantum
it does.
mechanics.
It's very much Hugh Everett III's 1957 PhD thesis applied. But it's applied in a very interesting way. And I'm very much influenced here by the writings of a guy called Max Tegmark.
Hmm.
And Max Tegmark in 1999, I think it was, came out with a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment, which he called quantum suicide. And he argued that if you apply the implications of Everett's many worlds interpretation, and you apply the Copenhagen interpretation that effectively the act of observation collapses the wave function of reality, it effectively means that you, in your own instantation, in your own Everett mini universe, can never die. And it's exactly what I say in Cheating the Ferryman, and I bring in all the supporting information for this. So scientifically, you can prove by applying quantum mechanics that we never die.
Hmm.
In which case, then we have some very, very interesting ideas. Now, remember that Everett Many Worlds interpretation said the universe splits into identical copies of itself trillions of times a second. Every subatomic event creates a new universe.
Hmm.
Now, if that is the case, it does mean that there will be a universe that the outcome of every decision that every sentient being makes will come into existence. So
Hmm.
effectively, you're existing in a more refined version of your life. Every time you make a decision, you're refining it. You're following
Hmm.
one path rather than another. It's very
Right.
similar to Jorge Borges' book, The Garden of the Forking Paths, which is, Jorge Borges, the famous Argentinian writer, where he applies this as well. But I like always to use the idea of Groundhog Day. Remember in Groundhog Day, the character Connors, he realizes he's living the same day. He wakes up the next day and Sonny and Cher are playing on the radio. I want you, babe. And then he lives the day, and then he goes to sleep, and he wakes up the next day, and the same song is playing. So he realizes he's caught in a time loop, and he's living the same day over and over again. This is what happens in Cheating the Ferryman, and it's your whole life. And what happens is every time you live a life, I call it, by the way, I have a term for that. The actual living the life is called the Bohmian IMAX. It's in deference to David Bohm, the
Hmm.
Anglo-American physicist.
Hmm.
And I do this because a guy called Daniel Dennett had a concept called the Huxleyan theatre, no, the Cartesian theatre. And I think that life is not a Cartesian theatre, it's a Bohmian IMAX, in the sense that, like a theatre to an IMAX, the difference.
Hmm.
So what happens is that every decision you make puts your life on a different pattern. But the
Hmm.
same would have occurred for your parents and your grandparents. They would have all been making decisions that
Hmm.
would change your life in so many ways. But then
Right.
if you take Everett's many worlds interpretation, and again, if you apply something that's even more interesting, there are two other scientific concepts that are less well known. One is the John Kramer model. I can't think it's called the interactive model of quantum mechanics, which effectively argues, this is phenomenal stuff. He argues that the universe is created out of retarded and advanced waves. So in fact, advanced waves, I think it's retarded waves are waves that going to the future. But there are other waves that are going into the past. And the
Hmm.
present moment is the interaction point, basically the holographic effect of the two waves coming together to create a holographic reality, which is the present moment. And that present moment is moving forward all the time.
Hmm.
So that's one thing. So the past is affecting the future. So effectively within this world, there is no past, present, and future, as there isn't in quantum mechanics. You cannot tell whether a subatomic particle is traveling backwards in time or forwards in time.
Right.
So you just don't know. So,
Hmm.
and then the final thing was the last paper that Stephen Hawking wrote with a guy called Thomas Hertog. And he had something called the top-down hypothesis of quantum mechanics. And that in effect states that from the first moment of the first zeptosecond of the Big Bang, everything was already there in potentiality. And each wave function collapses something that's already there. It's
Hmm.
just we don't perceive it, but it's already
Right.
there. So therefore, again, quantum physics. So it's not just Everett's many worlds interpretation. It's much deeper than that. It's much more interesting than that.
Hmm.
Is that there are trillions of versions of you and me. We've had this interview hundreds, thousands of times. In fact, I interviewed Danny Rubin, the guy who wrote Groundhog Day,
Mhm.
and he told me that he had planned that the Guy Connors would have 6,000 Groundhog Days.
Wow.
And indeed, he gave copies of my first book to all his friends at Harvard because he said this guy's done the science of Groundhog Day. So, so the idea is that that
So let me just
effectively,
ask you this one question. Sorry, just to interject.
yeah.
Is there a point at all where we can break out of this loop, this sort of infinite sort of repeating cycle of the same life? Is there a point where we stop doing that and
I believe
sort of break free?
I cannot do the science of it, which I like to do. So therefore, whatever I say now is completely speculation. But I
Hmm.
believe yes, and I believe the reason is that although it sounds very teleological in the idea that there is an end game, there's a reason why this is happening, which of course implies a design in itself, which I tend to shy away from. But
Hmm.
effectively, if there is if we are using the analogy of a computer game, the computer game comes to an end. Effectively, after, like again, the Groundhog Day analogy, Connors lives that day 6,000 times, and he starts initially being selfish. He wants to bed the girl. Then he still realizes he has an opportunity to learn, so he starts teaching himself the piano, foreign languages, etc. Initially, to again get the girl in bed. That's what he wants to do. He wants to impress her. But then he
Hmm.
starts to realize he has an amazing power. He can do good for doing good's sake. So by the end of the movie, I don't know if you remember, he's running around the town trying to save people's lives. He
Yeah.
sits under a tree when a kid falls out of the tree and he catches him. And this is because he's suddenly become more aware of his greater something, aware that he's part of something greater,
Hmm.
basically aware of his demonic and his uber demonic self. And when he
Right.
does that, he becomes what in technological terms within Buddhism is an avatar, a bodhisattva within Hinduism, somebody who has broken out of the cycle and is aware. And some people, I believe genuinely, there are people that have broken out of the cycle, the Bohemian IMAX, and come back in to the Bohemian IMAX to help us.
Hmm.
Now, again, this is not necessarily an original idea. There was a play written in 1937 by a guy called J.B. Priestley, who was a British playwright, who, again, I wrote a book on a few years ago. And Priestley in 1937 wrote a book called I Have Been Here Before. And
Hmm.
the central character of that play is a guy called Gortler. And Gortler is exactly what I'm describing. He's somebody that has lived his life many, many times, and he chooses to go back into the simulation to stop a couple making a terrible mistake in their lives. And
Hmm.
he goes back into the simulation to do this. Now, again, we have examples of how this simulation argument works within movies. Vanilla Sky. In Vanilla Sky, the Tom Cruise movie, which, by the way, was based upon a Spanish film, Open Your Eyes. It's not an original movie. He took the script and changed it. But you remember in that film, there's an instance where he's in a bar and one of the designers of the instantation, the simulation he's in, manifests in front of him in the bar. And he
Hmm.
tries to explain to the Tom Cruise character, a guy called David Ames is the Tom Cruise character. And he tries to explain to him that you're in a simulation. And David Ames turns around, oh, shut the F up. And as he does so, everything freezes around him.
Hmm.
And he realizes it's a simulation. And he said,
Right.
I told you, this is not real. It's Plato's cave. It's, the idea of Plato's cave. It's the idea that we believe our
Hmm.
senses. We believe from our five senses that this is giving us an accurate one-to-one depiction of what is out there. And
Hmm.
any person that studies the brain, any person that studies consciousness studies or perception studies will know that's nonsense.
Hmm.
The brain is inwardly creating all of this as a
Yeah.
simulacra within our brains. What is out there is probably just squirrels and wiggles of some form of hologram, basically,
Right.
and our brains are just processing the hologram.
How do you sort of refer to, or what do you think about all those reports of people that have been um, put under regression hypnosis and remembering their past lives? And there's this famous doctor, I forgot his name, but he wrote this quite famous book about past lives, and all those patients,
Ian Stevenson.
possibly, yeah, and they all
Yeah, it's
remember
University of
different
Virginia.
lives. different lives that they lived before, but they were different people in different times. So your theory is that we keep being reborn in the same body, the same year, the same similar circumstances, but the same person, but yet they remember that they have been different people having
But
different lives.
as I said, they're tuning into uber daemonic memory.
Right. So they
They
remember
think that
someone else's.
they're maybe remembering somebody else's memory. They're not remembering their own.
Hmm.
And also, you know, with all due respect to Ian Stevenson's book, Stevenson had some interesting ideas and things, but it was self-evident that a lot of people were conning him. It's. I've even been told that by somebody who knew him, to say he was extremely naive and he wanted to believe. I'm not
Hmm.
saying that his cases weren't valid, but like one of his arguments is, the way in which the wounds, when somebody was shot in a previous life, the wound would be in the reincarnated person. Well, why would that be? What process is taking place there? Now, effectively, if you go to India, and I've been to India a number of times, it's a culture dependent upon, they all believe in reincarnation. They also have the caste system. Now, I will guarantee that if you start looking at the vast majority of reincarnation cases in India, you will never ever get a high caste person claiming that they are a reincarnation of a lower caste person. It's
Right.
always a lower caste person claiming that they were a higher caste person. Why is
Right.
that? It
Ego.
doesn't make sense, but it does if it's pecuniary. If there is financial advantage to be gained to pretend that you are somebody other than and you are a famous person.
Hmm.
I'm not saying it's wrong, because I think my model can explain this, but we have to take into account that people aren't always honest.
Hmm.
You can't just take people's word for things. You've got to be a bit cleverer. Like I work with hypnotic regressionists. I have a number of friends who do it professionally. One particular friend of mine has been doing it professionally for years. When he came across my book, it was the first thing he said to me. He said, "I've suspected this for years. They're tuning in. It's like a radio station." He said, "I hypnotize them, and it's as if they go and they start tuning in,
Hmm.
and they tune into something, and they tune into a life, and they repeat it to me."
Hmm.
And to me, that makes rational sense, because, as I said, at a higher level, we are all one conscious. You're still tuning into yourself, but that the Eidolon, the past life consciousness that you're tuning into is not an Eidolon. It's part of the Uber Daemon,
Hmm.
if that makes sense. If that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Actually, so let's another question I have that just sort of came up. What do you think, if we sort of step up higher a little bit, why are we here at all? Why are we here in this physical realm, experiencing all those lives, having this simulated reality? Like, and if that's the case, who are we really? Are we really the daemon, or the soul, the spirit? And if we are the soul and the spirit, is there another realm that we can live as that consciousness, as that sort of spiritual, is there like a spiritual realm, astral realm, or whatever, where you can also have
Um, well, to me, yeah, there may be an astral realm, and I work with a lot of people who travel into the astral realm, like a friend of mine, Jürgen Sieber, for instance, who's written a series of fascinating books on this. But to me, the astral realm just seems to be just a little bit idealistic. It seems to be sort of everybody's kind of dream world of what heaven is going to be like.
Mm-hmm.
And the question has to be, what are you going to do in this astral realm for eternity? Remember, eternity is an awful long time to be wandering around plucking a harp, or wandering around in lovely fields of grass and things. It's you've got to think it through as to what that would be for. Now, obviously, it may be. I can't do the science of that, but I do. But all I do is take the science and say what the science tells us. Now, your question of, well, what's it all about, is the
Purpose.
billion-dollar question that human beings have asked since the first moments of human consciousness. I
Right.
don't know. Um, who is that? Has the simulation been created, or is the simulation just something that happens within the universe? I don't know. I mean, why? I always respond to the question like, why is there anything rather than nothing?
Hmm.
It's a kind of a question you can never answer. Um, is somebody planning it? Maybe, maybe not. Are we in a simulation created by our own advanced selves, a couple of thousand years in the future? It could
Yeah.
be, but I
It's
can't
like
prove it.
it's like we can play a video game, right, or on PlayStation or something, and we can play GTA or Tomb Raider or whatever other game. And why are we playing games where we can actually go and experience life in its real form? We can go to the beach, we can do hiking, we can
Yeah.
travel, but yet a lot of people choose to play video games. Maybe you can sort of translate that concept higher up, like why is our consciousness playing this physical simulation
Well,
game?
as I said, I think just
For
going back to my
entertainment, right? For entertainment, maybe to learn something, maybe to test themselves, or there's a lot of theories about that,
well,
right?
they're not even theories; they're speculations. That's quite important. They're not
Right.
theories. They're not scientific theories. They are speculations. When
Speculations, yeah.
people turn around about my theory, I don't have a theory. I have, at best, cheating the ferryman is a hypothesis, but
Hmm.
probably it's a speculation because I can't prove it scientifically to the extent that I can take it into a laboratory and
Hmm.
prove it in that way. So I'm very careful when I use the term theory, speculation, hypothesis.
Hmm.
So going back, remember I mentioned before, if we are one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, that
Hmm.
consciousness embodies itself within the universe and then it forgets who it is. Just like if you were playing, imagine a scenario when you're playing Tomb Raider, for instance. Imagine
Hmm.
the scenario that you could forget that you're a game player and you're playing it in a virtual reality haptic feedback suit. And you're in Lara Croft's body in a haptic feedback suit. And initially, when you're there, you know you're the game player. But then you drink the waters of the Lethe, wipes your memories clean, and suddenly you are Lara Croft. And you've got no way of knowing that you're not Lara Croft, particularly in a
Right.
VR environment,
Hmm.
particularly in a really good VR environment where
Yeah.
there's complete feedback. So you've no way of knowing. So in which case you can live Lara Croft's life and you can enjoy it as an entertainment. And that's why people play computer games,
Hmm.
because it's an escape. It's a way of going into a different world, exploring a different reality in a
Hmm.
different way. Now, people, I'm surprised that you haven't picked up on the one thing that people do point out my theory. I just did it there. So my speculation. And the idea is, well, what happens to children who were born with leukemia, who die in agony after a couple of months?
Hmm.
My counter argument to that is, well, there's two things here, or three things. Firstly, although it's my speculation and my ideas, it's not my creation. I'm not making this. I'm not making a moral situation. It's the first one. The second one is, if you're an atheist, your world would consist of this child being born only once in the whole history of the universe, living for a month in absolute agony, and then dying. That's cruel. I find that morally difficult to come to terms with. If you're a religious person, you believe that child lives for a couple of months in absolute agony, then dies and goes to heaven and
Hmm.
spends the rest of eternity praising God and wandering around in this beautiful Elysian field with blue skies and lots of beautiful things.
Hmm.
Then the question has to be risen: does the child then grow up? Does the child grow into an adult in that world, or do they stay as an infant? And we
Hmm.
don't know. There's none of those answers. They're never answered because nobody knows.
I think,
Cheating the
when it comes to the child analogy, suffering child with cancer, leukemia, I think maybe the reason is that we come here to suffer. Maybe that's the whole point, to
so you
experience
genuinely
suffering.
so just to get this right, so you think
Because
it's so this child has chosen as a previous person to
Mhm.
die in agony with leukemia.
Yeah, I think it's possible. If you're looking at things from our perspective, it seems preposterous and crazy. But if you're looking from the perspective of a elevated spiritual being, that knows way more than we do and experience reality in a completely different way, they might have their own reasons for doing this.
They may. I mean, I,
Maybe it's about
I could,
transcending suffering, and really through suffering you
yeah,
can
but then
transcend it.
you've got to say, okay, so how does this work scientifically? How does this consciousness embody itself in a child? How does it get there?
Yeah,
How does it
that's
get into the brain of that child? How does it become that child? Cheating the Ferryman doesn't have any of these problems. Cheating the Ferryman has none of these issues, because Cheating the Ferryman would also argue that, and going back to my child analogy, Cheating the Ferryman would say that, remember, anything that can happen will happen within the ever multiverse. Therefore, there will be a universe where the science started earlier, medical science started earlier, whereby that child will be born into a world where there is no leukemia because they found a cure for it.
Mm-hmm.
So that child will then grow up and live a normal life.
Yeah, but what's the value of normal life? You can ask yourself. Why, from our perspective, maybe it's valuable, but from a perspective, like elevated perspective, it's just, as you said, it's just a simulation. So what's the whole point, right? So I think so in your theory, in the Cheating the Ferryman theory, you don't believe that
Hypothesis.
consciousness can embody, the body basically, or be connected to the brain.
Well, my question is, I don't know how you can explain that scientifically. How can you explain that to a scientist? A materialist reductionist scientist will say, we are our brains. When the brain dies, we die. The consciousness dies and it just goes into the ground and everything else. So you have to then give a model of how this disembodied consciousness that has presumably self-awareness, chooses. So the argument is, so when somebody dies, they get, I know, because I've heard this idea, so you choose, and you're sitting there in this room, in this magical place, and somebody stands next to you and say, this is what you did in your life. What would you like to do next? Would you like to go back as a Chinese child? Would you like to go back as this? What things would you like to learn? And then you go back in. Well, I don't understand how you come out and go back in the first place. So that's the first point. I don't understand that process of how that works. It doesn't mean it might not happen, but for me, I have to start with the science. I have to start with the logic, because I'm trying to get these ideas across to people who are materialist reductionists, who believe there is nothing outside of us but this physical universe.
Well,
And they won't accept this. They unless you can give them proof, they're not going to accept it.
Right. I think everyone has their own sort of way of waking up, you can call it, or something, where there's a lot of people, very reductionist people, very scientific, that only rely on hard facts, that then have some kind of a, transcendental experience, and they start to look at life differently. But I wonder, like...
But I'll guarantee their transcendental experiences can be explained by Cheating the Ferryman.
So just so I understand, in Cheating the Ferryman, you don't believe that consciousness can be embodied in someone's, brain, and you just believe that we are the brain, and that's it.
No, that's not
So
what I believe.
I'm confused.
There is effectively, and this is only what I believe rather than what I can prove. I mentioned earlier on the Akashic field and the Akashic record. And the Akashic field is effectively 0 point energy. And Laszlo and I, do you know Irvin Laszlo at all?
I heard about him, but...
okay, he died last week. He was Professor Irvin Laszlo. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize twice. He's a very, very interesting man. And he had a concept called the Akashic field. And the Akashic field is basically 0 point energy, or the quantum vacuum. And within the quantum vacuum, there is massive amounts of information. And that information is what creates this world. It's the kind of the digital information field that this world comes out of. It's rather similar. Again, do you know the work of David Bohm? He had a concept called the implicate and explicate orders. Okay, Bohm worked with Einstein.
Oh yes, Bohm. Yeah.
David Bohm.
Yes.
And he was fascinated by holograms. He was fascinated by the idea that there is an information. If you take how can I say this? That if you go smaller and smaller in size, way beyond the atoms, there's a point where it becomes empty space, where there is nothing between you because you're so small. But there's a number of factors between being at that point and being at the smallest possible size, which is called the Planck length, the Planck
Yeah.
square.
Yeah.
And he argues that in that area, there is such a huge amount of literal space that could accommodate so much. And he argues, like David Bohm did, that the information is drawn up from this field by the brain. The brain effectively is it's something that is used to draw the information up. Do you know orchestrated objective reduction? Stuart Hamerhoff and Roger Penrose. Okay, they have come up with. Roger Penrose was a mathematician, Cambridge mathematician. He won the Nobel Prize last year.
I actually asked him a question. I was at a conference once where he was, and I asked him a question about black holes. So yeah, I know Roger Penrose.
Okay, he's a very interesting man. And Stuart Hamerhoff, you'll probably know, is professor of anesthesiology at the University of Arizona, I think. And he has long been fascinated as to where consciousness goes when you take anesthetics. When you put anesthetics in the brain, where does consciousness go? Because if you haven't total anesthetic, you're there and bang, you're back again. You lose everything. And they argue that what is happening is that when you take the anesthetics, it switches off the ability of little structures within the neurons of the brain called microtubules, and it switches off their ability to attune into this information field that's been drawn up from the 0 point field. So consciousness seems to come from there. So the brain is like a radio receiver. It processes information from somewhere else. So going back to your point, and I think it's a reasonable one could reasonably argue that by modulating the signal, another consciousness could attune into this one or any other consciousness, and it could. And indeed, in one of my books, I discuss in great detail drop-ins in terms of people who are mediums, where suddenly something else comes into their mind and gives them information. And of course, then we've got to take into account DMT, dimethyltryptamine entities. What are they? What is their role within all of this? And I think that in order for science to progress, we need to have a working model as to how this will work. And I think that there are a number of people going down certain routes, and I met a number of them, including you, by the way, at Contact in the Desert, whereby I always feel that there's a rock band I really like called Little River Band, who are an Australian band in the 1970s. And in one of their songs, they have a line where they say, there are many paths up the mountain, but the view from the top is still the same. And I think that's so valid because there are a group of us all wandering up different ways up the mountain, but we go getting to the top. And when we get to the top, we'll all go and sit down with each other and go, this is my contribution. And somebody else will say, this is my contribution. And it all fit in. And none of us are right and none of us are wrong. We're all bringing a little bit of what we think the worldview is. I mean, I spent a lot of time talking to Chris Ramsey while I was there, the magician. Yeah. And Chris and I want to work together because I'm fascinated about some of the things he was telling me about his magic. And I think that we can make something really happen. And we can smash through. Now, your question then would be, if we find out and we know scientifically and prove scientifically that we are living within some form of simulation or some form of instantation, what happens to the instantation? What happens to a computer game if the on-screen sprites become sentient and become aware that they're in a computer game? It's like the, what's that film with Jim Carrey, where he's in a simulation. Yeah, the Truman Show. Yeah. When Truman becomes aware of the fact he's in a show, the whole show collapses in some way or other. Right. And maybe that's what it's all about.
Playing the game differently too, right?
Yeah, maybe that's what it's all about. And I feel now at my age, I don't have many years left, so I'm rushing more and more to get my ideas out there before I pass over into another iteration of the Bohmian IMAX. Next time I'll start younger, I think. Really.
Do you feel like, I wanted to ask you this, so we're operating in this paradigm. A lot of people sort of believe that all the science we have right now, the relativity, the classical Newtonian science too, it's all sort of discovered. We kind of discovered everything we can, and now we can operate from that paradigm and basically find out more about universe. But all the theories that are to discover are already discovered. I feel like, I wonder if you agree with me that there's still yet another huge discovery to be made,
Totally.
uh,
We
maybe
are at
even
first.
larger than relativity.
Oh yeah, we're at first steps. I mean, effectively, I quote in my lectures. I think it was about 1897. A guy called Michelson, who did the Michelson-Morley experiment, was opening the Ryerson Laboratory at the University of Chicago, and he made this long speech, and he famously turned around and said that science is almost complete. Future scientists will be calculating to the sixth decimal point because that's all we have to know. We know everything.
Mm.
And literally 4 years later, 3 years later, Max Planck in December of 1900 stood up at a conference in Berlin and said, the only way I can explain black body radiation is that the energy comes in quanta. And that changed everything. Suddenly, the whole worldview of our understanding of science changed overnight. Then 5 years later, Einstein comes along with his great year with his 3 papers, and everything changed. But this means that it will happen again. You know, this is what I was talking about earlier, the theory of scientific revolutions, that the seeds of the next revolutionary change in science is already being discussed. It sits within. It's the, as people have argued, it's always the black crows or the white swan, the white crows or the black swans, that they outriders, the things we can't explain, that are the things that the future science will develop. I mean, for instance, with black body radiation, it was just they couldn't understand why radiation didn't expand the way it should do. And it didn't. And it was just Max Planck, with an act of desperation, as he said. And what's going to happen is it's going to happen again. And suddenly, and I think the catalyst is going to be consciousness. The catalyst is going to be somebody trying to really understand what consciousness is, because they don't want to know. The materialist reductionists and the eliminative materialists pretend there's no such thing as consciousness. People like Daniel Dennett and the Churchlands, we're all fooling ourselves into thinking we're conscious. But every sentient being on the planet knows that's utter rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
But effectively, that's where the clues lie. And I'd like to believe that there are a group of people on this planet at the moment who are working to change that, are working to make come out with that one bit of information that will change everything. You know, if we could prove out-of-body experiences, for instance, or remote viewing, if we could prove it absolutely, you know, if somebody could get out of their body, go into another room, have a 6-digit number, come back and tell us,
In a
it would
way,
change
we
everything.
already have, didn't we? Like, there has been so many experiments
Have
with
there?
remote
Have there?
viewing.
Have
Yeah,
there?
with SRI in the 70s, Dean Radin. There's so much data that we have proving that there's
When you start to dig into those, they're not quite as convincing as people would like you to believe. I mean, for instance, Ingo Swann supposedly saw the rings of Jupiter before they were discovered. If you actually look at what Ingo Swann actually said, rather than just believing what everybody believes, that he saw the rings of Jupiter, he turned around and he said he saw things coming out of the surface of Jupiter, not going round, coming out of the surface. What people also don't discuss is something else he said in the same statement. He saw the volcanoes of Jupiter poking out of the clouds of Jupiter. Jupiter's a gas giant. There are no volcanoes on Jupiter. So what was he seeing?
Yeah,
What was he seeing? But people don't know this because they don't read the papers. They don't go back to the sources. The other thing is the famous case of Miss Z, which is much cited, which involved a young woman with Charles Todd. And she supposedly read a 6-figure digit. Nobody was watching her. It's not as if she was in a room where it had glass walls. Nobody was watching her. And she got it wrong 5 times. It's only on the 6th time she got it right. Even if she was floating out of her body, surely she would have seen it first time. She didn't. Nobody witnessed it. Not only that, but there was a really strange effect. She had electrodes on her head. And the time that she had found the number, the electrodes went crazy. And the analysis was, that was when she was being telepathic. Or it could have been when she was taking the things off her head to get up and look at the number.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you've got to be a little bit more, I don't know, just
Rigorous, maybe. Right?
rigorous. Yeah, rigorous. You have to be rigorous. I'm not saying she cheated. All I'm saying is that any rational person will look at that and say, there are no moons. In fact, I argue that he was out of his body, by the way, and I say that he confused things. What he thought was the surface of Jupiter was in fact the moon Io, because Io has volcanoes on it. Right. And I suspect that because he couldn't control, he claimed he could control getting out of his body, he could control the imagery. He couldn't. Nobody can. I don't know anybody that can actually do that. What I believe happens is you go into what's called a hypnagogic state, and then you see things. And I have hypnagogic imagery, and I know people that have hypnagogic imagery, and you do see things that suddenly come from nowhere, and you see them, but you can't control them. You can't make them happen. I mean, I work with numerous out-of-body experiences. I know of no out-of-body experience that can get out of their body at will and go into the next room. I know none of them. I'll put a challenge out there. If there is, I'd love to hear from you.
How about
I can guarantee there are people that can get out of their body when they get into certain circumstances, but they can't do it at will. They can't do it in a laboratory condition, because that's not how it works. All my friends that actually have out-of-body experiences, veridical out-of-body experiences, they happen spontaneously. They don't expect it to happen. They will work on it, and then suddenly it will happen. But they can't even control where their body is moving.
Right. How about this Stargate program with military and CIA, where they had those psychic spies that spied on Russians, discovered the submarine, all those pieces?
But remember the law of averages, the law of if you throw enough spaghetti on a wall, some will stick. How many times did they get it wrong?
So you're saying that there isn't enough convincing proof for remote viewing, or you're arguing that it's not real?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying remote viewing is real, but I'm saying that they cannot do it at will. And the information they get is normally incomplete. If you actually look at the information they get, it's not 100%. I'll give you an example. Ingo Swann was a good friend of Charles Tart's. And Charles Tart moved away from the East Coast and went to California. And Charles said to not Ingo Swann, sorry, Robert Monroe. It was Robert Monroe. And he said to Robert, I've got a new house. I'm living in a new house. See if you can visit me, remote view, and visit me and tell me what my new house looks like. Robert rings up a few weeks later and he said, I managed to get out of body and I got to your house and this is what I saw. He was 50% right, and I can't remember exactly what he got right and what he got wrong. But the things he got wrong were crazy. He got the wrong colour curtains, he got the carpet was the wrong colour, the room was the wrong shape, but there were other things he got absolutely right.
Right.
So to me, what is happening here is that if you read Andreas Mavromatis's book on hypnagogia, it's really interesting because he argues, like I do, that we can get into these states and we can see things, but our own expectations get in the way. They colour them. My friend Samantha Lee Treasure, by the way, she talks about this as well. And she's a very capable out-of-body experiencer. But it seems that sometimes things just don't seem right. It seems that there was a guy called Celia Green and Charles McCreery. They had a thing about out-of-body experience. They called it the metachoric experience. It's the idea that it's kind of a dream sequence where your memories, your expectations, and actual information all get mixed in together.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't choose which channels are going to be feeding the information. The
Right.
training people need to do is to be able to focus in on the bits of information that they know are salient rather than the periphery stuff, the dream bits, as it were.
Yeah.
And the metachoric experience, I think, is a really, really powerful argument. You look at, I mean, for instance, you look at Robert Monroe. Some of his
Mm-hmm.
stuff was absolutely astonishing, what he could do. And some of his others was just absolutely bizarre. I mean, effectively, you know, the concept of I there. He used to embody himself in the body of somebody else. And he'd just drop in like a spirit, dropping in behind this
Wow.
guy's eyes. And he wouldn't know what the meeting was. He'd be in a meeting and he just dropped in. And of course, Robert didn't know what was happening. So he'd start stuttering. And he said there was one time where the guy's wife, Ivor's wife, was looking at him as if he was crazy. And he said, but I didn't know what to say.
Wow.
I believe that was a real incident
Yeah.
that really happened. He dropped into somebody's mind. In fact, a friend of mine did a short movie about it.
Mm.
I'll send you the link. It's really good,
Sure.
about that incident. It's really, really good.
Wow. You know, it seems to me, I've been studying this stuff for some time, and it seems to me that all the psi and ESP is very fleeting, very flimsy,
Mm,
very unreliable. But perhaps it's because it's so. In order to do that, you have to access this higher reality it's so incompatible with our physical dense reality. It's almost like we live in the ocean. We have fins and everything, and all that stuff exists in the water or space. And to do
mm,
that, we kind of have to get out, but our body is completely made to help us survive in this physical world, and it's
yeah,
completely incompatible with those higher realms you have to achieve to be able to be good at it. That's why it gets in the way. That's why it's so, you can't put a finger on it. It's very hard to it's not so precise like the science would like. But I still believe there is enough evidence. But I think the resistance from the mainstream science comes from the fact that they don't understand how it works. So they have all the evidence they can have, but there's a lot of it. But because they don't know, they don't understand the mechanism by which it happens, they reject it. Because if they don't understand it, a lot of scientists are very much ego oriented. They need to know, they need to
yeah.
understand. They can't explain something, they worry they'll look stupid, or their prestige will be at stake, so they just
I
sort
mean,
of.
even more the case, I think what they do is because their science can't explain it, therefore it didn't happen. And that really annoys the life out of me because I do events with scientists and we have debates. And afterwards, we'll go out for a couple of beers and I wait for it. And I wait for one of the scientists to turn around and say, yeah, the stuff you write about and everything else, it's total nonsense. But he said, but there was one thing that happened to me once, which I've never been able to explain. And I wait for it. And then I'll turn around and I'll say, okay, so you can't explain that. You know you experienced it. Your science can't explain it. Doesn't that make you question your science? Oh, no. And I said, so why don't you admit that you've had these experiences? And they always say, I can't. Academic tenure. If I turn around and said, it's like Brian Josephson, the Nobel Prize winning British quantum physicist,
Mhm.
because he's interested in ESP, he's been an outsider for years, even though he's a Nobel Prize winner, just because he has the temerity to try and understand what's happening in ESP. It's wrong. It's so wrong. And it's so naive. It really is that there is so much evidence out there.
Mhm.
I've had psychic phenomena, I've had precognitions. I've seen somebody precognize a set of circumstances before it happened in front of my eyes. I know that happened. And we
Right.
all have these experiences. And if science can't explain it, science is not complete.
Exactly.
There
So
might
we
be some fascinating new energy form that we could discover by just taking the blinkers off,
hmm for
and
sure.
and realizing.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Well, that's what I'm hoping to do with the atomic clock experiment. And if we can prove that consciousness is fundamental to physical reality, that it's a substrate of physical reality, and you can, if you master it, you can kind of edit the physical reality as if you're a hacker and you're coding, right? Which probably, I feel like that's the case. And going to like aliens and ET and all that realm, perhaps they are so advanced that they are able to do that. They are capable of
Mm.
editing reality because they
I
master
think
their
something you said earlier when we were having our general chat beforehand, I thought was very, very good. You know, the idea in which they can actually warp space time
Mhm.
effectively. They can manipulate space time, and I thought that was
Exactly.
really an interesting comment.
Yeah. And it's just imagine that our ESP and psi abilities are primordial, very kind of like, baby steps. We have some semblance of those abilities, but they're very barely noticeable. But if you have intelligence that's a million years older than us, if you
Mm.
extrapolate those abilities that we have a million years in the future, perhaps they have complete mastery of it, and yeah, they can edit space-time metric, they can
Well,
bend.
effectively, you know, just one of the things that we actually know from modern science, non-locality. You know, effectively, I think that the greatest event that happened in science in the last 100 years took place at the Paris Institute of Optics in 1981, when three guys, Alain Aspect, Dalibard, and Roger, proved non-locality and proved spooky action at a distance. It should have been headlines around the world. It wasn't. It's known. There's a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna, which is doing amazing things with entangled particles. And effectively, that means that two particles, once they're put in the same quantum state, they communicate instantaneously. There
Mm-hmm.
is no space between them. And it's because, as David Bohm would say, at a lower level of reality, they're the same object. It's just we're looking at it with our world and we see them as two. And in
Right.
fact, funnily enough, I've just finished reading the new Dan Brown book that friends of mine said I needed to read because it was quite interesting.
I read it
Um,
too.
and, and there's one section where he lifts David Bohm's aquarium model and he doesn't acknowledge him. It's absolutely extraordinary. He makes out that it was some kind of guy who was an artist. It's the bit where he's trying to explain non-locality in two objects. It's a fish in an aquarium, and they think the fish is moving in a particular way, and they think it's two fish until they realise by looking at a different angle the fish is moving in certain ways, and it's a single fish. And he,
Right.
he does that in there, but he doesn't acknowledge David Bohm. I'm absolutely astonished as to why he didn't do that. But it's an interesting book. You know, to give him credit, you know, he goes in a lot of the areas that we're interested in,
Yes. Yes.
and you know, although it's not terribly well written, it's a hell of a good story, and it certainly goes along at a pace, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost. I feel like the book is written in order to almost open people's eyes to to ESP, all those alternative science, you could say, and he puts too much emphasis on that and not enough on the story. So when you're reading, it's almost like an infomercial.
Yes, I
Yeah.
agree. He uses the people as kind of talking heads. It's suddenly, you know, for no apparent reason, they'll start explaining something, and it
Yeah.
doesn't fit in with the narrative. It is
Yeah.
odd,
Yeah.
but I suppose it's very difficult because normal people like you and I do, and people like when you're in contact with the desert, we talk about this nonsense all the time. But effectively, normal people aren't doing that particularly. But it was interesting, and if it makes people think, as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned, that's good.
That's great. Yeah, I know you have to go. I just want to ask you one last question. What is your view on ETs, on the disclosure, what's happening right now? The government and those increased sightings. Who are they and what do they want, basically?
I am absolutely fascinated by the whole disclosure thing, by the whole implications of it. I mean, I was at Contact in the Desert 4 years ago when the first disclosure took place, and I was having lunch with Linda Moulton Howe when it happened, and
Mhm.
she just got so excited and rushed off, and they all did a press conference. And I do find it intriguing because it seems to be another aspect. It's the ice cream man, by the way. Another aspect of things we're talking about. I think that there's
Mhm.
another stream where we can learn an awful lot. Now, I have a concept I call the egregorial, which is basically that there is a close relationship between ourselves and the ETs. And I wrote a book a few years ago called The Infinite Minefield, where I pursued this because my own personal interest in UFOs was the thing that started my whole interest in the whole subject back in the early 1960s.
Mhm.
So I've been involved in this thinking about ETs for many, many years. So when I was at Contact in the Desert and having sitting with people like Hynek and Whitley Strieber and people like that. It was like heaven to me. It really was. And Jacques Vallée, it's just extraordinary things to be able to do. But I think this is going to be a very interesting area. And I think particularly if we tie it to DMT entities and in fact near-death experiences as well, because I'm in my latest book on near-death experiences, I link all three. So I link DMT entities, UFO entities, and the beings that people meet in near-death experiences. And I think they're all linked. I'm not sure how yet. It's again like the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle.
Right.
But once they fit in, it'll make sense.
Yeah.
But because the question is, these are physical objects. There's no question they are out there. The Tic Tacs are out there. Yeah. I don't know if you know, but last year there was a real weird event at Contact in the Desert where a group of people came rushing in and a UFO had flown over the back, over the top of them all, and then disappeared in the distance. Then 20 minutes later it came back again. Really? And then disappeared. And yet nobody saw it in the hotel and nobody saw it on the freeway outside.
Wow.
Which means it was appearing to them.
Right.
Pardon?
I was there last year, and I went to Chris Blatsoe event Under the Stars, and I did see an orb that was flying past exactly at the time that he said it would. I actually even recorded it.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but it seems to me that they are entities basically that are more advanced than us, and therefore they can sort of move freely between this physical and more of an astral dimension, if you will, or however else you want to call it. So, they can move between those. That's why they can appear out of nowhere. They can edit the physical reality as they see fit. That's why they seemingly break the, our physical laws, but they don't break them. Maybe they can edit them, right? Yeah.
I mean, one of the strange things, when I got back last year, I did another UFO event in Southend in near London, and a lady came over to me after I'd spoken, and she had a video film on her phone, and it was extraordinary. And she shows it, and she's looking out through a window across the Thames estuary, and you can see a group of about 12 UFOs flying in sequence. And the front one was flicking to the back, and it was doing like that. And then she turns around on the video film. You hear her turn around and say, "Can you see? I'll open the window." It must be the window. It's a reflection on the window. She opens the window, and you can still see it. And then she turns around. You realise there's somebody else in the room. And she turns around to this other woman, and she goes, "Can you see that?" And the woman goes, "I can't see anything." And as this lady said to me, she said, "My friend couldn't see that." And she said, "But look, it's on the film." Wow. She said, "So it registered on the film, but my friend couldn't see it." And to me, that is extraordinary. What does that tell us? It means that they appear to certain people and can appear on film. Right. Yet they seem to be still mind created in some way. It's extraordinary. Mind-blowing.
Yeah, it is.
We live in exciting times.
Very exciting times. And who knows, we might get an announcement soon or something. But I do think that the real disclosure will not come from the government. It will have to come from within each and every person, right? That's my
You're right.
view. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was amazing talking to you.
Absolutely wonderful. Love discussions like this. Really makes you think. My brain is buzzing at the moment. I've got so many ideas. So thank you for that, Kai. That really has made me think.
Thank you. Thank you as well. It's very stimulating, and there's not many people you can do this with. So it's if you find someone like that, it's a treasure.